hear me okay? Thank you for the opportunity to come here and to learn from you and to present about this topic about qualitative research and its use in evidence-based medicine. So I'm from Sydney, involved with the Cochrane Kidney and Transplant Group. We are close colleagues to Cochrane Australia, and we're very interested in the work that Living Evidence is doing, and we're particularly interested in the use of and applying that in the nephrology space. I work a lot in guidelines, in both quantitative and qualitative evidence synthesis, so I'll talk a little bit about this today. So this is a piece of work, a qualitative study that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine, so a great journal, about the experiences of undocumented migrants in the USA who have end-stage kidney disease, and about their experiences about, in end-stage kidney disease, patients are followed on a dialysis schedule, maybe twice or 3 times a week, but these patients, they turn up to emergency and then require emergency hemodialysis. And this, there's a quote here from one of the participants: "When I talk to other undocumented people in hemodialysis, I say, live your life to the fullest, because we don't know if you'll be here next week. Sometimes when I say this to my companions, it scares me." In a companion piece of this, some work on the experiences of clinicians and their perspectives on actually managing and treating these patients, which was published in Annals of Internal Medicine. They really identify that the huge burden that this is upon them, and the concern that they have for these patients. So people are hyperkalemic, can die in 2 seconds. They go into arrhythmia. It just seems like we're playing Russian roulette to some extent with these people's lives. So this is a question and identified something that's happening using qualitative research that potentially quantitative research couldn't really answer. And as a result, it gives a really rich and deep understanding of this problem. And another quote: emergency hemodialysis makes us feel very inhumane. I don't like to call it compassionate hemodialysis, which is what they would call it in the US. We're actually torturing these patients. So it got a lot of media attention. This is the NBC News website, and talking about the burden that it places on clinicians. And as a result, this actually had a policy change in Colorado. This is an email that went out to say to all providers, healthcare providers, that now under Medicaid, under Colorado's system of health insurance, that dialysis treatment is covered, and these patients no longer need to turn up to emergency to get emergency hemodialysis. They can be followed on a dialysis schedule and improving their health outcomes. So today I'll talk a bit about what qualitative research is, what its definition is, what its purpose is, and give a brief overview of approaches. And then, thinking about how, if we read a piece of qualitative research, how we can assess its rigour, as you may do for, under quantitative randomised control trials, which we're all familiar with. Sorry. So this is just a nice quote that I thought I'd read out. "Qualitative studies help us understand why promising clinical interventions do not always work in the real world, how patients experience care, and how practitioners think. They also explore and explain the complex relations between the healthcare system and the outside world, such as the socio-political context in which healthcare is regulated, funded, and provided, and the ways in which clinicians and regulators interact with industry." So to define qualitative research, it's quite an umbrella term, that it seeks to describe and analyse the culture and behaviour of humans in their groups from the point of view of those being studied. It's a blanket designation for all forms of social inquiry that rely primarily on qualitative data and understanding the meaning of human action. So it's not surveys, it's not anecdotal, just one person's experience. It's a systematic, rigorous process. There's frameworks, and they're actually quite complex because there's various methodological approaches that you can take towards it. If we think about the definition of evidence-based medicine that was proposed by Sackett in 1996, he said it was an intersect of clinical judgment, clinical expertise, the relevant scientific evidence, which we're thinking about, randomised control trials, observational studies, but then also patient values and preferences. And you can think about this in the context of, in clinic with a patient, you're making a decision, and there's shared decision making where their preferences and values are incorporated into that decision. But additionally, it could be that you are informed by an evidence base that incorporates what the wide perspective of patients' preferences and values are, and that can help you facilitate a conversation or shared decision making in clinical practice. Furthermore, that qualitative evidence synthesis is used widely in guidelines that can actually support guideline recommendations, and that's the underpinning evidence that's being used. Additionally, and we'll talk about this furthermore, it's advocated for each guideline recommendation that there's a concept of patient preferences and values. Sorry. So we think about the purpose of quantitative research, which we're probably all well familiar with. It's really about quantifying relationships between variables, their associations, their correlations, causations, and measuring that strength of association. While qualitative is different. It's to describe and understand, to explore a central phenomenon, and explain behaviours and decisions. It can help to generate hypotheses. And furthermore, it helps to explain some of the associations that you may find in quantitative research about giving some kind of contextual or social reasons why there is an association. So we think about the purpose of qualitative research. You can think about it as an iceberg. So at the surface level, there's this maybe something that you're seeing, maybe it's published in the scientific literature, maybe it's something that you see in your clinic every day, but underneath the water there's this huge, the vastness, right? This is the depth of the iceberg, that this is the rationale, this is the reason why people do things, their interactions with other things, how they sit in their context, in their culture. Furthermore, I like to think about it as being, colourful. This is Aboriginal, the Australian Indigenous people, their art form. This is very beautiful the way they paint. And furthermore, it's very useful for giving patients a voice, which is widely advocated nowadays. So some kind of the questions that you would think that qualitative research can really help answer is, thinking simple things like why patients aren't coming back for follow-up, why are they refusing to take medication, why are living donation rates declining, and thinking about how you should design an intervention to ensure that it is acceptable and uptaken by the population. And there's a nice example of the rotavirus that's being evaluated here, and the work that they've done with acceptability is really a key, how that qualitative and quantitative research can work together to ensure that there's wide impact and uptake. And furthermore, thinking about what research is actually important to patients. So if we think about that last point, there's a series in The Lancet where you may be well familiar with about research waste, and they estimate about 85% of research is wasted. And essentially one of the main reasons they identify that is because they think that research being conducted, or they know, doesn't match the priorities of patients. So it doesn't really get to the end user, who is the patient. And there's various groups like the James Lind Alliance, we're using the power of qualitative research and quantitative research together. And as a mixed methods approach, you can help identify what research is important to patients, and ensuring that research conducted is meeting patient needs and values. Furthermore, in mixed methods, it can be used in identifying what outcomes are important. So to be measured in quantitative studies, such as randomised controlled trials. So there's the Common Initiative, which is a large database of various patient-reported outcomes. And then in the nephrology space, where I work in SONG, which is standardised outcomes in nephrology, doing very complex multi-methods research with multiple stakeholders, patients, caregivers, clinicians, various people involved, to identify what outcomes should be measured in trials. As an example, this graph on the left here is looking at osteoarthritis, knee osteoarthritis. It was published in The Lancet, and it's looking at the trials that were done, and this was published in 2000, and what patient priorities were. And we see that drugs were the research was mainly conducted on. However, we think the patient priorities were largely based on education and knee replacement, but there's been very little trials done that. Again, moving into my bias of the kidney space, a lot of the research done is published research that, or registered trials or funded studies is research that is done that is not in the top 10 priorities of patients. Another example of the power of qualitative research, this was a trial that was published in the New England Journal about a surgical safety checklist. And this is, the items weren't just, very biomedical, making a mark on with a marker on a patient's body of where the incision or where the surgery was going to occur, but it also incorporated things about the team, the environment in the operating theatre. So people would be introduced, they would know who their names are, what their role is in the operating theatre. And this is a large multinational, multi-centre trial, and it had marked effects on improving mortality and morbidity in non-cardiac surgery. But then they tried to replicate this kind of checklist in other settings, and they couldn't do it. And one of the main issues was this: is that you think about the operating theatre as a very complex social ecosystem where different roles, one operating theatre at the same hospital next door to each other could be very different based on the people who are involved, their relationships with one another, how they run the operating theatre. So a lot of qualitative research has examined this study, and a synthesis of that data has been published, looking at what are the cultural, why was this surgical checklist not being able to be replicated in other settings. And a book published by the senior author on that trial, the Checklist Manifesto, kind of details how they came up with the checklist, and then additionally about the issues about replication and thinking about the social and cultural importance of the settings that research is implemented into. Furthermore, consumer involvement is widely advocated in research. Looking at, in Australia, the National Health and Medical Research Council, the National Institute of Health, and even in the UK as well, essentially saying that if there's no consumer involvement, that research may not be funded. And this could be done in multiple ways. You could have patient partners where people who are patients who have lived experience of the disease are actually involved in the design, the analysis, they're part of the author team. Furthermore, you could do qualitative research prior to the grant application, or embedded in the grant application, that's saying we're going to identify what the patient's experiences are, their priorities are. We will design the intervention accordingly to make sure that there's impact and it is translated into practice. Furthermore, consumer involvement in guidelines, clinical practice guidelines, widely advocated from all the organisations like NICE in the UK, the WHO, the Institute of Medicine. Ensuring that consumer involvement, it ensures that the guidelines are scoped and they are appropriate to the population of interest of patients. So this is just an example of some work that we've done, and this is in patients who are on dialysis, and some of the work with the SONG group, identifying that fatigue and lifestyle, like sort of life participation, being able to live a normal life, are really the core outcomes that patients identify, and being able to work with a patient partner, Nikki, who was there, which is one of her patient partners, and this was a qualitative piece of work where we sat with patients and researchers and clinicians to say what kind of intervention could we design, develop, co-produce to ensure that there's uptake. And it was decided about an exercise app, but additionally not just what the intervention is, but what the content will be, how it will be layered, how it will be presented. The use of qualitative research in guidelines, as I said, as an example, the NICE guidelines on renal replacement therapy and conservative care guidelines. There's recommendations on information and education. The evidence that underpins that is all qualitative evidence synthesis, so all qualitative research. And additionally, using the kind of adopted approach that most people now use in grade for guideline development. For each recommendation, there is points that need to be brought up in about equity or patient preferences and values. And this may be done by having patients in the guideline working group. Additionally, it may be done by using actually qualitative research, having primary qualitative research or evidence synthesis about what patient preferences and values are to underpin guideline recommendations. So briefly, as an overview of approaches, as an example, we'll follow this one. It's about vascular access. So it's like a surgical intervention that patients on hemodialysis need to have. So this is a big problem for patients. Some patients delay actually getting it created due to they refuse to get it done. The patients who do have vascular access, it's a great stress towards them. And so an aim for this study would be to describe patients' expectations and experiences of initiation and maintenance of vascular access for hemodialysis. So you're thinking about questions of, what are patients' beliefs, concerns about vascular access and why? What does the vascular access mean to the patient? What are the social, personal and lifestyle impacts that vascular access has? What challenges do patients face and how do they cope with it? So how you would sample a population for this if you're going to do this qualitative research. In quantitative, obviously, you have a larger sample size, and that is around reducing sampling error, having adequate power to demonstrate a response. Usually it's done it's random, so either randomization in a randomized controlled trial, and in a qualitative, it's a smaller sample size. But the idea is that you are selecting participants who are information rich, who are going to provide a lot of insight and a lot of depth about the topic of interest. So you would be purposive. So you would sample a population that have different experiences. So you may have someone in that study there who has vascular access, has had it for some time. You may have some patients who are going on who are due to have their vascular access inserted and put in, or patients who have actively, to have refused to do it or have delayed having it. There are also multiple methods that you can use for analysis, and they talk about, in qualitative studies, about theoretical or data saturation, and this is a term that means in the research with the participants, as you did more and more interviews or whatever data collection you use, there was nothing new emerging, that you had reached a point of saturation, and this is usually a mark of when recruitment should stop. So the various approaches, obviously there's interviews, which would be well known to you, but it's about eliciting individuals' perspectives. It's a form of conversation where knowledge is produced from an interaction between the researcher and the interviewer or the interviewee. There are probes, so you can ask for clarification, you get people to elaborate, but it's essentially an open dialogue. It really provides information that is in depth. It's not structured, so it's not asking a question, yes or no responses. Generally, it's usually open-ended questions. So this is it's usually semi-structured, where there is some sort of guide, but that guide is adaptable as the interview goes on because it builds rapport and allows the conversation to go where it naturally is. Furthermore, there can be in-depth, and this is thinking from the Australian perspective, the Indigenous community big on this kind of approach where they term it yarning, where it's a really open-ended conversation with no real structure or definitive, these are the questions I'm going to ask. And focus groups is another big use of data collection in qualitative studies. So it's an in-depth discussion. It capitalises on group interaction. And this is a nice quote that I'll read out. Encourages interaction between research participants as much as possible, where group dynamics work well as the co-participants act as co-researchers. Taking research into new and often unexpected directions and engaging in the interaction that is both complementary and argumentative. So this is a facilitated discussion. It's not a group interview where I ask one person one question, then I go to the next person to get their response. It's a natural dialogue around a table. And it's not meant to achieve consensus. It's about exploring and clarifying views. The analysis is really taking all that information that's gathered from from those interviews, the data collection or focus groups, and it's essentially you are trying to capture the breadth and the depth of that information in succinct in succinct forms, sentences, paragraphs that are interpretable to the audience, that make sense to the audience and whoever that may be. So they may be, you're writing for a medical journal and they're going to be clinicians, so you would write in that context how you would convey that information. So you need to be comprehensible, insightful, trustworthy, compelling and original. Obviously you need to answer the research question, as all research should do. And the goal is to describe that phenomenon, the experience. So this example would be the experiences of patients on vascular access. So you want to describe that phenomenon in your results. And you potentially, depending on what approach you use, there's various approaches where you may develop a theory or an explanation. And if you're writing for social sciences, psychologists, maybe this is more appropriate depending on the journal that you would publish in. So finally, looking at rigour. How can we assess rigour in qualitative studies? So the goal is really to provide a concise, coherent, logical, non-repetitive and interesting account of the story the data tells within and across the themes. So it's really based upon the data. Convince the reader and the merit and the validity of your analysis. So you think about constructs in quantitative research, so the ones that are usually used are reliability, validity and generalisability. Now these reliability being if the research can be reproduced. This is not really the goal of qualitative research because of it's very context specific. Validity, there are some similarities between the qualitative rigours which have been proposed by Lincoln and Guba, widely known, widely used, of credibility, dependability, transferability and confirmability, and we'll go into that a little bit further now. So we think about credibility, can the findings be trusted? So there's multiple approaches that people can take in qualitative research where they could say, there's multiple realities that exist. So some people may be quite saying this exists independent of me, while other qualitative researchers will have an approach where it says this exists due to my interpretation, the participants' interpretation of their experiences. And there's things that you can look for when you're reading a piece of qualitative research. So if you're thinking that, look, the question guide, they've provided it, maybe it's in the appendix, maybe it's in a box, and those questions are appropriate for what their research question is. The sampling that's been done, they're aimed to gather a wide range of perspectives and demographic, clinical characteristics of participants. It provides a thick description. So this is providing a thick description of the context, so where the research was conducted, who the participants were involved, and that's really described in detail. Reflexivity is about the researchers and their involvement in the study. So thinking about if there's a piece of qualitative research and that's being conducted by the primary physician of that patient or that participant, there may be concerns about reflexivity there where the participant may not want to discuss everything that's involved around that aspect that you're examining. And additionally, there can be use of triangulation. So that's use of different methods. Maybe it's use of mixed methods. Maybe it's use of focus groups and interviews. It can really give it a lot more credibility. If we looked now at dependability, so here's the process, logical, auditable. So the interpretation is intrinsic. It's not feasible to produce identical findings across contexts, across studies. But there is a coherent link. So the methodology that's being used, the methods that have been used, and the data that is captured, the findings, there's a coherent link between all those. So things that you may look for if you're reading a piece of qualitative research is that you're thinking about did they record the data? Was it audio recorded? Was it video recorded? Have they transcribed that verbatim, word by word? How have they analysed that? Do they use computer software to help with that coding process? And then we think about transferability. So are the findings relevant to other settings? You can think about this maybe similar to generalisability, but it's a little bit different. So the concepts and the theories are relevant and have implications elsewhere. So this could be about providing detail about the participants, their settings, their characteristics, and then being transparent with that, and then the audience would read your study and think, look, this is very similar to my population, potentially there are findings here that are relevant. And furthermore, in discussions of qualitative studies, if you're reading it, you would look for, have they compared against other studies, in similar settings, maybe similar diseases, that can give you an understanding of how transferable these findings may be. And then finally, confirmability. Are the findings and the interpretations linked to the data? Very important. So this is conveying that the findings are not just a product of the researcher's imagination or their interpretation, that it's actually grounded in the data. So, you could have quotations that are really compelling within the text or as a table that really underpin what the finding is stating there. Furthermore, there are other things that you can look for in the paper where they talk about investigator triangulation. So that means there's multiple researchers looking at the same data. Maybe they come from different perspectives, different specialties, different methodological expertise, and they're arriving at a consensus about what the breadth and the depth of the data is saying. Furthermore, there could be something what they call member checking, where the data is actually provided back to participants, or a summary of the findings provided back to the participants, and they can provide input on this. Do they agree? Do they want to elaborate further? Appraisal. Appraisal of qualitative studies, of the conduct of qualitative studies, is contentious. Some people are very for it, some people are against it and think that in principle that it is wrong. There are potential tools that can be used. The CASP tool, which is used across multiple study types, including qualitative studies. And just a nice Goober 2008, essentially asking questions about, was the sample used in the study appropriate to the research question? Was the data collected appropriately? Was the data analysed appropriately? Can I transfer the results of this study to my own setting? So again, that transferability. Does the study adequately address potential ethical issues, including the relationship between the researcher and the participant? And overall, is what the research has done is clear. So this is really getting at those kind of 4 criteria there about confirmability, dependability, credibility, and transferability. Furthermore, another approach is to assess the reporting, not the conduct, but the reporting of the study. And the Equator network, as you may be familiar with, has various reporting checklists available, and this is one for primary qualitative research. There's also a reporting checklist for evidence synthesis, qualitative evidence synthesis, or systematic reviews. So in summary, qualitative research methods, they help capture and communicate the voice of the patient, which is widely advocated nowadays in all funding bodies across the world and in guidelines, that the use of qualitative research can impact the design of interventions in clinical care and also in policy, and it is a transparent and systematic and rigorous process. Thank you. I think that's it.